All right, so in the last video we built a counter component, and in this video we are going to create a counter wrapper which will manage the state for our app, and the counter component will run some functions and pass those values back up to our parent component, our counter wrapper, and then render that stuff. And it's all complicated, but it sounds complicated, but it's less complicated than it sounds. So the first thing we need to do, this is the state we left our app in last time, with account and some names and some buttons. All right, so inside our counter component, we're going to clean some things up. So the first thing we're going to do is we are going to get rid of our state object for name. And we're actually going to move our on-click handler for set count to another function, like outside of the button click itself. So we're just going to copy that down, and we're going to call set count +1, and make sure this is increment. And this will just clean things up for us a little bit as a good starting place. So this will become increment. And decrement. And we can also get rid of the name on whatever line that was that I just deleted. So when we load this, we should get any day now. There we go. So we have increment and decrement working like we would expect. So let's create ourselves a wrapper component that will put this stuff inside of, some of this stuff inside of. So source components, we'll call this counter _ wrapper.tsx, RSX, Acura RSX, counter wrapper.tsx. We'll start by importing React from React. I'm going to export a const called counter wrapper, which is React function component. And we'll return, can you guess? We're going to return counter. So in order for this to work, obviously, you're probably a step ahead of me. We need to import counter. So we're going to import curly braces, counter from the current directory, counter. And then we're going to update our app.tsx file to import, instead of counter, because we're importing that in counter wrapper, we're going to import counter wrapper from counter wrapper. I know what you're thinking. Why are we adding a weird layer on here that we don't need? It's purely for demonstration purposes. So basically our app is going to remain unchanged, and that's good. That means it's working. So now it's time for us to make some changes to the counter itself, and how our on-click handlers work. So first thing we want to do is we need to remove state from the counter wrapper, or sorry, remove state from the counter, and we need to move it into the counter wrapper. I feel like I'm just saying the same things over and over again. So we're going to delete that from there. We're going to break our app, and that's okay. And in counter wrapper, we're going to paste that in. We need to import use state along with React up here, curly braces, use state. That's going to set a count for us, right? An initial count. And we're going to pass this count now down as a property to the counter from the wrapper. So we're just going to add this on here. We're going to say count. Actually, let's call this number, because I think that'll be easier for us to keep track of things. So we're going to call this number, and we're going to pass count into that number. Now, let's take a look at what's happening over here in our browser. We have an error, right? Type number is not assignable to type intrinsic, basically really complicated stuff. But property number does not exist on type counter, right? This stuff is hard to read. It's still hard for me to read. But basically, TypeScript's like, yo, you assigned a property to your counter that doesn't exist on that component. So let's fix that. So that's the first thing we'll do. We'll come into counter. And if you remember from earlier, when we defined some props for our greeting component, we're going to do interface. We'll call this count props. Let's call this counter props because that's nice and semantic. And then it's going to take a number, which is, you guessed it, a number. And then we have to tell React function component to extend its own properties with the ones that we've just defined above. So counter props. And then we have to pass those in as an argument. Is it that? As a deconstructed object, number. And then instead of calling count here, we're going to call number. And if we save this, there's going to be some other things that happen, right? We cannot find set count. That's because we removed state. We don't have a setter inside the counter itself. So if we remove those for now, we can, we can get rid of those. Whoops. Me and my Vim. You know, sometimes when you watch tutorials, you're like, man, that person types so fast. Not me. Maybe that's good that I'm trying to do it this way. You guys have time to keep up with me as I type. So those things will basically do nothing right now, and that's cool. So if we save this, we should be back in a pretty good state in the browser. Our increment and decrement buttons aren't going to work, right? Because they're not doing anything. We haven't told them to do anything. So let's make those work. And actually, let's take a moment to kind of review where we are too. So we have now two components. We have counter and counter wrapper. So counter wrapper right now manages state, right? That's where use state is being called. And it renders the counter component and passes the state object of count down into the counter through the number property. So inside our counter component, we have defined an interface for number. Oh, let's remove this real fast because we don't need use state in here anymore. Get rid of the uglies. All right. So we've defined an interface with a number that is a number. We've passed that into our function. We have a couple of methods here, increment and decrement. We call those things. And down here on line 19, we are rendering the number property that we defined in our interface, right? Well, in order to make this component talk to the parent, we are going to use properties again for that. So we can come up here and we can define a new property. And this one is going to be, we're going to call this onChange because that's what's going to happen. Now this is an on-click handler. There is some really funky ways of defining these TypeScript types, and they're complicated, and I always get lost. So in true prototyping fashion, we are going to define this as any, and that's going to tell TypeScript that this onChange property can be anything, and that's fine. You wouldn't do this in production code, but it's totally fine for prototyping. So what we're going to do is inside of these functions now, increment and decrement, we're going to call onChange. So we're going to call the onChange and we're going to pass in a value. And do you know what that's going to be? Number plus 1. And this one is going to be, onChange. We're going to pass in number just kidding. onChange number minus 1. So that's going to take the current number that's been being passed into the component and send it up to the parent so that we can do something with it. Now, our app will complain because we didn't define onChange inside of our counter wrapper when we rendered the counter. So if we go into counter wrapper, we can do that now. A little bit of formatting so that we look like we know what we're doing. So we're going to reference the onChange property, and then we're going to tell this component what to do with it with a function. So we're going to say on change. What do we want to do with it? Well, we want to take the value that was a number that you are sending back up to me, and then I want you to do something with it. I want you to set count with the value. All right? So as we do this, oh, what did I miss? Did you mean on, I didn't mean on change, but maybe I did because I spelled something wrong. On change. I don't know. What did I do? Cannot find name on change. Where from counter TSX line 11. I'm not entirely sure. Oh, this is watching me code. I mean, this is literally how I live my life. So line 8, we need to tell our counter to actually use on change. We didn't pass it in. We defined it up there, but we didn't pass it in as part of our properties. Now, if we save that, things are going to get happy again. Thanks, TypeScript. So we have increment working and decrement working. And that's all pretty cool because now the state is not being managed from the component, from the counter itself, but rather the parent component. This is a really useless example, but you will encounter things like this surely as you start prototyping, and this is how you would handle it. So for those items inside a child component that you need to have manipulate the state in a parent component, you just use properties with an any type on them. And then you call that property, you call the property like you would call a function, pass a value to it, and then you use the parent component to do something with that value. So that's that. Like I said, if you're looking for real development lessons, this is not where you're going to find it. This is where you're going to find me hacking my way through TypeScript. But so it makes it fun. So, all right. When we come back, we will take a look at the use effect hook. And that comes in really handy when you have to do something interesting on page load. Cool.